Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. Greetings and welcome, Sean. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast show.
Well, thanks for having me, Bilal. It's good to be here.
Now, before we talk about your latest book, To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism, which I thought was a fascinating book, I do like to ask my guests something about their origin story. So it would be good to know, what did you study at university as the undergrad level, and was it inevitable you'd end up in as an academic studying history and writing books?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question. In some ways, this book is a little bit of a return. Although, it's my ninth book, so I've done a lot of work over the years. In some ways, I'm actually returning to early themes that I first started diving into as an undergraduate. I have to say, I have to go back even before college. I mean, to some extent, I was more of your typical kind of a math sport nerd jock type growing up. That is to say, I think like a more ordinary path might have seen me studying math or economics and perhaps going down the path of perhaps some type of investment banking, or maybe even, God forbid, a hedge fund or something like that. But I had these amazing history teachers in high school, and so they really kind of wrenched me completely onto a different track. I'm actually still in touch with my AP European teacher, Debbie Doyle. This is from sophomore year in high school. We're actually still in touch. Sadly, my AP American teacher, a very, very charismatic man. In some ways, he was kind of my model for style for a historian. He would wear these suspenders or braces into lectures. He did AP American history, a class in Vietnam I took in high school. I already pretty much knew when I got to Stanford that I was going to study history, and there were some great historians who were there, people like Jim Sheehan and David Kennedy. They had a really strong European history tradition, in particular, going back to people like Gordon Wright with French history. And I think even before David Kennedy, they had an Americanist. Was it Bailey Johnson, I think might have been his name. He wrote one of the American pageant textbooks. So they had a great historical tradition. But I had already started studying French, and so some of it was just kind of exploiting opportunities, although I started doing German too as an undergrad. But I spent a lot of time in Paris then. And this is really the first book I got to go back to my early work, which is actually on the French Revolution. I came up with a slightly eccentric title, or even, not even the title, from Beaumarchais to Chénier. It was about the theater in the French Revolution. But one of the great things about that project was I got to work in a whole bunch of different archives, really charming places in Paris. And among other things, I was enraptured by both the story of the French Revolution, the drama of it, but also some of the darker periods. I had one of the playwrights I was writing about actually sat down in front of the Committee of General Security and burned his own play. And I also started reading the other playwrights. I finally got Sylvain Maréchal into one of my books. He was the one who wrote this, Le Jugement Dernier des Rois, The Last Judgment of the Kings. This is almost kind of genocidal play where the final scene, and it's very cheerfully described to the stage notes, all of Europe's assembled royalty and aristocracy, they're all gathered on this volcanic island, and the volcano explodes, and they're all kind of sucked into the bowels of the earth. It's just this incredibly evocative language that gave you an idea that all those stories about the guillotine and about heads on pikes in the French Revolution, it's not just that it happened in reality, but that actually a lot of the intellectuals were beginning to kind of celebrate political violence, really, as almost this kind of cleansing thing. And so in some ways, I'm kind of getting back to that. My grad school years, that's when I started studying Russian, and I started spending a lot more time eventually in Moscow and studying the history of communism. But in some ways, I think my interest grew out of my study of the French Revolution, everything from the conspiracy of the equals to just the idea of a kind of an ever radicalizing revolution where the state acquires more and more power over its subjects, and there are these visions of radical social reform and overturning the social order kind of almost in a moment zero way. The French revolutionaries, of course, even did away with the old calendar, and they started counting over from zero in 1792. And so a lot of the radical movements of the 20th century were already adumbrated in the French Revolution. So that's kind of where I'm coming from intellectually in the project.
That's great. In some ways, some of those themes you're talking about in terms of radical change, social change, let's rip up the old order, sort of feels very familiar today in terms of what we're seeing across the world.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think it ever goes away. This vision, I think, kind of once the idea is injected out into the bloodstream, like we have to start over from day zero, with getting rid of all of the old verities. You could see it in China's Cultural Revolution, where they're talking about the four olds. France in 1792, or, even to some extent, a lot of the radicalism on Western university campuses today, which in a lot of ways actually have more radical energy than the old communist countries do, in a lot of ways, as far as overturning culture and, overturning all kinds of traditions and experimenting now with things like sexuality, identity, all of these things where people are just almost creating things de novo. It's almost like we can't quite escape it. It's just such a powerful impulse that seems to recur in different form. It never repeats itself exactly. I mean, it's kind of, instead of maybe history repeating itself, I think the line was that it might not repeat itself precisely, but history often rhymes. And I think we are seeing a lot of that around the world today.
And for this book, you focus on communism. And so what was the motivation behind writing this book? Because after all, the Soviet Union disintegrated, at the end of the 80s, early 90s. So that's over. And so why talk about communism now?
Well, I think there was this idea. I mean, the Fukuyama line is really famous about the end of history, but you saw it in, I talk about this short Richard Pipes history of communism. It came out about 23, 24 years ago, where he said, I was writing the obituary, goodbye. We tried that. Goodbye to all that. Part of it is that I don't think it's actually true. I mean, just in the literal sense that the Tiananmen Square massacre should have kind of disproved the Fukuyama thesis. I mean, to be fair to Fukuyama, it was a more subtle point he was making, but that said, this idea that kind of history was going to end with the last man in Western liberal democracy, and he didn't mean it entirely as a good thing. I mean, to be fair to Fukuyama, he was kind of saying, he was taking some of the color and the meaning out of life, and maybe it's even somewhat implicit in his message that eventually someone would want to wreak havoc again and kind of start history over. But it's easy to kind of dump on Fukuyama. What interests me more, I suppose, and the impetus in the book, is the way that certain ideas and even practices reminiscent of communist regimes, I mean, aspects of surveillance, social control, censorship, that we really thought that we were done with. I mean, you look back at the early days of the World Wide Web of the 1990s, and everyone thought it was this new dawning age of freedom. And, we would all be free to speak our thoughts, and you'd get maybe ground up movements around the world, and authoritarian governments would tremble and all the rest of it. And instead, something like the opposite has happened. You have this rise of all kinds of different flavors of authoritarianism and censorship and social control and surveillance. I mean, the more specific impetus, I think, for the book, it actually came out of a conversation. I have to give credit to my friend Nick Floyd, a very serious British military historian who just came out with actually a new book of his own on the Eastern Front, which I can't take any credit for the book, but he did consult me a little bit because I've written on similar themes, but he did a fantastic job both with research and synthesizing, I think, and really producing by far, I think, the best history of the Eastern Front out there. We were just talking as historians just about kind of tricks of the trade, what's going on. We can't travel. This is back in the kind of the height of the COVID lockdowns. Just basically everything was shut down. The last time I saw Nick actually was at the Hoover Institution archives in California. I think the two of us were the only people in the entire building without masks on. And so maybe some of this was our natural ornery, slightly rebellious streak. We're just wondering what happened. A lot of people almost have this amnesia now, which is maybe, I think, we don't even want to remember what happened. Where the entire countries were shut down, entire industries were just shut down by government decree and diktat, a little bit selective. Not everything was shut down. Kind of travel controls, employment controls. Instead of loyalty oaths, we had things like kind of vaccination requirements. I remember coming into class and we had this little practice we were supposed to do for more than a year, where the students had to present this app on their phone. It was called Involvio, basically certifying that they were disease-free before they could take this class. And eventually I couldn't do it anymore. I mean, it's just, I felt like, isn't this the kind of practice of whether it was Nazi totalitarianism or communist regimes, in some ways even worse than some of their practices? I don't remember them ever actually quarantining the entire healthy population and forcing everyone to carry around these kind of disease-free certification apps on their phone that were being tracked by the government. I mean, people might have different views of either the necessity or the helpfulness of this or that aspect of public health policy. But if you took it all as a whole, and it wasn't maybe the same in all states in the U.S., it wasn't the same in all countries, but overall, it was kind of this shocking descent into what a lot of it was quite literally described as practice being imported from communist China. I mean, there's this quote of Neil Ferguson, not the Hoover Institution historian Neil Ferguson, spelled Niall, I should emphasize. Was a very, very serious man, and a friend whom I deeply respect. No, I'm talking about the Neil Ferguson, who became somewhat notorious in Britain, not just for his kind of COVID models predicting catastrophic health outcomes and deaths and disease and so on that helped to justify lockdowns. It was also famously, I think, caught violating the COVID protocol policies to go sleep with his girlfriend or something. So shocking act of hypocrisy. But the most amazing line, which I'm surprised it isn't more famous, is when Neil Ferguson was talking about, he was consulting with the British and the U.S. government, who ended up setting the model for a lot of the world, about policies. And he's saying, at first, we didn't think we could get away with it because, this was a communist Chinese policy. We didn't think we could get away with this stuff in the West. But then in Italy, first, we saw we could. And so we did. And so we went ahead. And he kind of talked about this quite matter-of-factly, proudly. Like, it was amazing. We didn't think we could get away with communist China-style lockdown, quarantine, social controls, surveillance, kind of control of people's movements. But we did it, and he was kind of proud of it, I guess. I think it's an odd thing to be proud of. But there it was. I mean, it wasn't even really all that subtle.
Yeah. And so this idea of social control, power sort of dynamics that you see within communism, obviously it has roots. The obvious godfather, so to speak, of communism is Karl Marx. But in your work and your book, you talk about the precursors. Marx didn't come out of a vacuum, and you talk about some of the earlier Greek philosophers, Plato, some of the Christian tradition, and then you talk about Rousseau and the French Revolution. So maybe it'll be useful to get some of the influences in this direction that Marx and communism had.
Well, yeah. So part of the backstory, I mean, I don't want to overemphasize Plato. It's just obviously he's so fundamental to the Western philosophical tradition. And then particularly you can see a lot of Plato's themes later reemerging in thinkers such as Rousseau. But before we even get to Rousseau, that is ideas about kind of a strong government, a republic, ideas of virtue, of kind of social control or conformity, or people either being in the community or outside the community, which are not exactly the same thing as socialism, but there's definitely a lot more talk of reducing hierarchy and the traditional notions that certain citizens had more worth than others. I mean, certain elements in Plato's thought are very hierarchical, but I mean, you read the Republic, it's just all kinds of ideas are bandied about. It's hard to summarize, but some of them were obviously cherry-picked, you might say, by later philosophers to help justify, particularly Rousseau, with his ideas about this radical republic and the social contract. But I think before that, although that tradition is definitely important, before that we have to talk a little bit about early Christianity, because I think there are certain elements in Christianity that are really important for understanding the later Marxist and communist tradition. First of all, just the idea, again, as against some of the more pagan Greco-Roman idea, where you did have kind of heroic citizens and legends and the gods, and that some people were just more inherently interesting or valuable than others. Christianity posited the equality of all souls. I mean, even of slaves, who of course were so prevalent in the Greco-Roman world, such a huge part of society. So to some extent, Nietzsche later called this the slave religion, but the idea of the religion of the meek, of the oppressed, that Christianity first emerged, even though there was a lot of hypocrisy over the centuries, that the ideal was kind of exalting or lifting up the weak and the poor, and in some cases with the famous example of Saint Martin of Tours, the idea of renouncing your own material wealth, that it's more virtuous, that is, to die in poverty, that maybe the poor have more value in the afterlife than the rich. Now, obviously, this is not the same thing as advocating the forcible abolition of private property, but what's interesting about it is when you blend this together with the Christian idea, which also does grow out of the broader Abrahamic tradition, although I think it's strongest in Christianity, the idea of proceeding towards a final judgment, sometimes called eschatology. I think this is really where a lot of the narrative momentum of Hegelian philosophy, that of Hegel, that of course Marx then adopts, the idea that history is kind of proceeding inexorably forward with this kind of unstoppable momentum. In both Hegel and Marx, you have conflict that's driving it, but you still have this kind of, it's not circular. It's not
so-called dialectic.
Right. Eventually, dialectical materialism, that is, history doesn't just kind of, it's not random like it might be in certain traditions. I mean, even in the Greco-Roman tradition, you read kind of Aristotle or, even really Herodotus on politics. The idea is like you have these different types of governments, and some have some advantages and disadvantages, and sometimes you have monarchy and sometimes you have democracy. No, with Christianity and then some of the traditions which grew out of it, you have the idea that no, actually things are progressing in one direction. It's quite linear. And eventually you're going to get, in Hegel, it's more like you get this relatively happy outcome, a blend of the modern secular state, but also Christian morality and kind of family values, and the exaltation of the individual and the individual rights. I mean, Hegel, for a lot of Westerners, maybe he's not really that easy to read, but you can kind of see in his vision, oh yeah, maybe that's kind of like the modern Western Europe, or a little bit like Fukuyama's Last Man. That's the way history is going. What Marx drew on certain other elements, I think, to inject radicalism into the Hegelian logic of the dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Obviously, class struggle is the first one, but he did read up on the French Revolution. So this is where Rousseau and some of the other thinkers come in. There's an even lesser known French Enlightenment era thinker called Etienne Morley, who wrote a more radical vision, which kind of blended together some of the rationalism of the French philosophers of the Enlightenment with the more Christian idea that, the ultimate sin was greed, that you had to not just renounce material wealth, but in the end eradicate all social differences. And what's interesting is that you can actually directly trace Rousseau's ideas expressed in the social contract about this republic where you would have kind of citizens and then maybe almost enemies of the people who would put themselves outside the political community. You can see that in the era of Robespierre and the Terror, in the way that this kind of extreme interpretation of Republican virtue is implemented. In much the same way, though, you can see the even more radical vision of Gracchus Babeuf. This is the kind of the pen name of a man who used to actually manage manorial property rolls for the kind of feudal system of France, and then kind of turned on his employers and became this radical tribune in the revolution and grew his hair long, and eventually created various conspiratorial societies. They all had various names, different names, but the most famous was the so-called Conspiracy of the Equals, which erupts really in the aftermath of the Terror. And they're advocating not just for the égalité and the idea of the equality of citizens, but actually the equality of result. I mean, what in today's parlance might be called equity. That is to say, it's not enough that everyone is equal under the law or that everyone has the right to vote, for example, but rather you have to eradicate material differences. And I think the reason Marx drew such inspiration from Babeuf, a lot of other socialists did too, but I think Marx in particular, is the fact that he was also quite upfront. He was very honest about the fact that he didn't think this would just kind of happen naturally. That is, it did require political violence. He was quite explicit about that. The idea is that the enemies of the people would kind of unmask themselves or be unmasked once the revolution was underway. And he was the first to start talking about also tactics. You actually have to infiltrate the police and the army. You have to kind of turn enough of them that they can mutiny, and eventually then you'll topple the government and you'll create these kind of central storehouses to distribute all the food. And it's a little vague what happens next, but the idea is like you will topple and overthrow the government, and you will enforce social equality, and you'll have enemies of the people, and you'll have the kind of the new elite class, I guess, of the exalted poor, the proletarians. So Marx blended together all of this stuff, and also his reading of the French Revolution, a little bit simplistic, the idea that it was kind of this feudalism giving way to capitalism, that history was proceeding in this direction, again, where the class war was becoming ever more binary, ever more simplistic. You get an ever smaller class of the kind of capitalist owners of the means of production, and ever larger class of proletarians. Again, he's drawing this really out of both his studies of history and of German philosophy. He's certainly not drawing it out of any experience of kind of factory life, of which he had none. But he was a very interesting thinker, and I think the real innovation that Marx made was partly philosophical, it was also just partly rhetorical. He simplified it. He made it kind of in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, published in 1848, he made it kind of mesmerizing, this vision, both the historical vision of this inexorable momentum towards the final cataclysm, but also the idea that workers of the world had no homeland, had no fatherland, so that the workers everywhere would unite to topple their oppressors. Workers of the world unite. He hadn't quite worked out how it would happen, that is, in practice, but he kind of laid out a very
I have to say, I agree. If you even read the Communist Manifesto today, it's really well written from a literary perspective. I mean, you can see why it motivated people. Now you do have this recurring theme about the relationship between bringing into reality a communist regime and political violence. What was Marx's view on democracy, or these are the French revolutionaries? I mean, what was democracy ever a path where you could just get the public who see the oppression of the proletariat? Wouldn't they not vote in the communists?
No, I mean, to give credit to some Marxist people like Rosa Luxemburg, for example, a figure at the turn of the 20th century into the early 20th century, she did think there was a kind of role to play in educating the masses and the workers who could eventually be won over the ideas. Marx didn't really think much of what I might call liberal democracy. I mean, he thought it was just one of the various ways in which the ruling class and the oppressors kind of pulled the wool over everyone's eyes. He thought it would require violence. Now, in Das Kapital, supposed to be his masterwork, he spelled it out a little more explicitly what he thought would happen. Again, this idea of kind of immiseration, the Verelendung or immiseration thesis that even as productivity might rise, the workers' share would decline. You get more and more proletarians. You get all the artisans and the kind of non-proletarian types. I mean, he obviously hadn't really figured out, like, how do you categorize household servants, for example, who are actually more numerous in most countries than industrial workers? He hadn't really figured it out in the sociological sense. But what he thought would happen was that wealth would get concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and eventually there would just be this kind of cleansing, violent moment where the integument of private property sounds, the expropriators are expropriated. Now, in practice in his lifetime, nothing close to this ever happened. The closest analog was the Paris Commune, which erupted in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. And again, they were not perfectly Marxist in the sense that, they didn't have full state control of the means of production. They didn't outright abolish private property. So in many ways, Marx could have distanced himself from this and said, well, it also ended really badly and was quite violent. It was suppressed violently. They themselves had been quite violent. They'd taken a lot of kind of bourgeois hostages and executed them. And there was this horrific violence that the Parisians later tried to almost expiate by building the Church of the Sacred Heart, the Sacré-Cœur, in Montmartre. But Marx did the opposite. I mean, he embraced it really almost at the moment of maximum publicity over the violence. And he actually endorsed and embraced the violence, basically saying that this is exactly what we have to happen. They're criticizing the commune because, there was arson and they burned down buildings and they threw women and children into battle and there was slaughter. And they executed these hostages in kind of cold, rational calculation. He said, all this is absolutely what we need because this is the only way you can make the revolution. Again, just like Babeuf, the class enemies will unmask themselves and they have to be put away, but they have to be killed, basically. So I think Marx made it quite clear. Again, there was no blueprint for exactly how the revolution would happen, but he made it clear that the revolution would require violence, that it would require, effectively some type of a revolutionary vanguard. This is, again, moving a little bit more into Lenin's view of things, but Marx had already implicitly endorsed this, the idea that, no, you would have to have, these ruthless revolutionaries who would seize power violently, seize control of the means of production, and then redistribute wealth, property, etc. He maybe hadn't worked out, again, all the details in practice because, obviously the ultimate utopia, as we discovered the 20th century, is pretty much impossible to achieve. But the idea that it required violence to get there, I think, was quite clear in Marx. And, Lenin made certain innovations we can talk about. But, I think that the essence of the vision is already there in Marx. This is what does distinguish him from a lot of other thinkers who did, they did have more qualms about violence, but Marx absolutely did not.
And when one reads Marx's work, one gets a sense that the types of countries that are most ripe for communism would be ones that have a capital base, some kind of industrial base. Yet it was Russia that, that communism took hold of, which was, in some senses, you could say, sort of backward in terms of economic development, more agrarian and so on.
Yeah.
Was that just because of opportunity, that Russia was just ripe for the taking, so to speak? Or was there some other motivation for why Russia took hold of this versus...
Well, I think opportunity is one way of describing it, but I think Marx was beginning to see that opportunity. Like any philosophy, dialectical materialism, Marxism, later Marxism, Leninism, and communism, they do respond to new information. And I think what Marx was already realizing in the time of the Franco-Prussian War, his real insight was that, look, whatever he wrote in Das Kapital, what was happening in reality was you have these two capitalist countries or so-called capitalist countries going to war with one another. And in his view, this is a very Hegelian view of dialectical materialism. One of them would be either more or less advanced. One of them would be either more or less authoritarian, capitalist, reactionary, etc. And one of them would also be weaker. And in Marx's view, he thought that France, because of the Third Empire, the Second Empire of Napoleon III, the Second Empire, Napoleon III, was this kind of decrepit, corrupt bourgeois type of authoritarian monarchy that it needed to be, as he put it, deserved a thrashing. So he wanted France to lose because he said that would lead to revolution. And it more or less did happen, maybe not in precisely the way that Marx might have drawn it up, but it did actually happen. He predicted it, and then it happened. Lenin would later actually evolved this into a specific doctrine he called revolutionary defeatism. But back to Marx himself just for a moment, because even before Lenin came on the scene, in Marx's last years, he started paying attention to Russia. And it was not because Russia was necessarily in the vanguard of capitalism. In fact, the time we're talking about, the late 1870s, early 1880s, Russia still hadn't really even begun the great industrialization drive that happened in the 50 years of the 1890s and the early aughts. Russia was still predominantly agrarian. Rather, Russia was the hotbed of reaction. It's one of these really curious things about Marx. You can date it all the way back to the 1850s when he's kind of corresponding with, he's already living in London by then, with various British figures. He had already started a relationship with this figure called Urquhart, who was just this like fanatical Russian Russophobe. And towards the end of his life, he actually started corresponding with Winston Churchill's father, curiously enough, again, a Tory, an arch conservative, but who was, because the Tories were in that era, they were far more anti-Russian, more Russophobic. The liberals, for reasons that are a little bit, we don't really have time to go into them, but they had actually taken a more sort of pro-Russian, anti-Ottoman line. So some of this has to do with geopolitics, and there was a war between Russia and the Ottomans in the 1870s. But so curiously enough, once again, you have kind of a conflict, these world historical headlines. The element of Marxism, I don't think everyone necessarily appreciates. Marx was he was a news junkie, in the way, and a lot of the early and the most effective communists were like this, They weren't always paying attention. Oh, there's a strike here, and this is what wages are, and this is what the 8 hour. Yeah, there was talk of those things among most socialists. What made the Marxists and the communists, I think, distinctive was what they thought really mattered were the kind of the broader currents of history, which might be great power war, so that I have to give some credit to Luxemburg too, but Lenin was the one who really sussed this out with his work on imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. Marx had already begun to hint in this direction with both the Franco-Prussian War, the Paris Commune, his ideas about you want one side to lose because you can have a revolution, but then also with looking at Russia as the hotbed of reaction, the weakest link in the chain, you might say, because it was kind of the least sophisticated and supple industrialized power. And then Lenin seized on this, and he saw that in 1904-1905, the Russo-Japanese War, that the Russian government had nearly been toppled because of being dealt a series of decisive, but ultimately not fatal military defeats. In the First World War, Lenin goes further, and he actually elaborates this both in Imperialism as the High Stage of Capitalism, and then an even more explicit work called The Military Program of the Proletarian Revolution, published in 1916, where he's literally envisioning and hoping for and hoping to organize the defeat of his own country. He called it, actually they used the kind of inverted quote marks, concerning defeat of one's own country. It's something that you want, something you work towards, so you can turn the imperialist war into a civil war. So in a sense, you're not wrong, this is opportunity, but it's kind of opportunity leads to this innovation in doctrine, that what seems to be happening in reality is not necessarily this kind of Marx's vision from Das Kapital about the plutocrats in their top hats, and eventually there's this tiny handful of them, and somehow the workers outnumber them, and so they finally just kill them off and take over the means of production. Rather, you had these great power wars between capitalist powers that were fighting over markets and territories and whatever it was producing the conflicts of the 20th century. And in the First World War, you had this cataclysm, almost to end all cataclysms, which of course meant opportunity. That meant, well, yeah, they've armed all these, well, in Marx's or Lenin's view, proletarians, or at the very least, poor people who now have arms. And if you kind of convince them of your message, they can turn their guns. And it's right there, actually, in the Internationale, the anthem of socialism, later in National Communism, that it's a mutiny. They're going to turn their arms against their oppressors. And so it's a more, you might say, supple or even practical vision, which then Lenin is able to implement in Russia. I mean, it doesn't happen exactly the way. I mean, it's a little more like the military defeat was supposed to precede the power seizure. As it turned out, it was more like the Bolsheviks seized power because they'd already started to promote mutinies and desertion in the armies. And then once they were in power, then they surrendered the war. But they exploited Russia's discomfiture. They exploited Russia's increasing suffering in what turned out to be really the third and then the fourth year of the World War in 1917, by turning the armies red, by proselytizing the armies, and eventually producing mutinies and desertions, and mustering just enough force to topple what was an increasingly unpopular government. Even after the February Revolution, so Kerensky is increasingly unpopular. He's kind of feuding with his military officers who don't want to fight for him. Lenin gets more men under arms and shows that this is how you seize power. You do it by force, you do it by bloodshed. Eventually, you're going to put your class enemies to death.
And you had this innovation of the so-called sort of Vanguard, or the Vanguard Party, Like, so he had a much clearer idea of how you go about grabbing power, more so than Marx did.
Right. And he had feuded with, interestingly, he and Luxemburg, this is Rosa Luxemburg, who, like him, was in exile from Tsarist Russia, but mostly from Poland. And unlike him, she kind of became a member of the German Social Democratic, the Marxist Party in Germany, and really a member in good standing. So she was a little bit less alienated from the mainstream than Lenin. They had agreed on certain things. They had agreed on the idea of kind of imperialist war and all the rest of it. Where they disagreed was on tactics for seizing power. And they'd had this feud, this kind of doctrinal feud in around 1903, 1904, 1905, where Lenin had talked about Vanguardism, as it's sometimes called, the idea you would have this kind of elite cadre of hardcore revolutionaries who would literally be professional. They'd be paid. They would specialize in the arts of revolution and political violence. Luxemburg, it's not that she didn't think there'd have to be violence at some point, but rather she thought you should try to educate the workers en masse so that eventually, you'd have kind of critical numbers on your side. So one of the things she didn't like about Lenin's approach in the Russian Revolution, although she kind of appreciated his success and his triumph, was that when Russia held democratic elections, even shortly after the Bolsheviks took power and the Bolsheviks lost those elections, they got only about 24% of the vote, which is still pretty impressive considering where they had been just 6 months previously. But they finished a very distant second place to Kerensky's old party, the so-called socialist revolutionaries, who were, they sound like Marxists, but they're not. They're more of an agrarian party that depends on a peasant base. And they had been more kind of patriotic and pro-war than the Bolsheviks. So they lost the elections decisively, and Lenin, the Bolsheviks responded by dissolving the parliament and killing a bunch of people and, just basically saying, we're stuffing out democracy. You can see why someone like Luxemburg and a lot of other European socialists would shy away from that. But again, in Lenin's view, and, I tend to the view that Marx probably would have supported Lenin if he had a choice in the matter. That is, that I think it's kind of true to Marx's vision in the way Marxism was evolving even under Marx, even in his own lifetime. That is, that you had to seize opportunities in these decisive moments, wars, revolutions, with a kind of, again, an armed vanguard, even if they're a minority. I mean, if they have the right ideas and the right vision, then they're the ones who are going to make the revolution. Basically, that it's not going to happen on its own. So this also sometimes called voluntarism. Luxemburg had this vaguer idea about spontaneity, that kind of like if you educated enough workers, eventually they'll do it on themselves. And what was interesting was she got the chance to put this in play in Germany, which, like Russia, was defeated in the war, and where there was a brief moment where it looked like there'd be a real thoroughgoing socialist revolution towards the end of 1918. And Luxemburg spelled out in the so-called Spartacus program her vision for how this might or might not happen. But her idea was that basically the workers had to do it themselves. And the part that's, it's a little bit almost, it's cheeky, is that she's kind of saying, like, if you do it, I'll be happy to then take over as your leader, but you guys have to do it, basically, which is on the one hand honest. On the other hand, it's obviously not as realistic as Lenin's view, because it turned out they did get together and they had this great big kind of national council of the workers and soldiers and sailors Soviets in Berlin, roughly equivalent to the Soviets, which had emerged in Russia in 1917. And they voted not to take power. They voted, no, you know what, actually, we think we should give bourgeois liberal democracy a try. And to her credit, Luxemburg accepted this as a democratic verdict, but then, ironically, she was outvoted in the Central Committee of the German Communist Party, who chose to rise up and try to overthrow that government by force in January 1990. This is what was called the Spartacist Uprising. And it's also kind of tragic in a sense, because Luxemburg herself was then executed in the course of that uprising. But what was interesting was, her idea of trying to educate the workers so that they will eventually kind of get it and vote in communism on their own didn't work. It didn't work in Germany. And in the end, it didn't really work anywhere else. In the end, Lenin's
with Lenin,
more successful.
In Marxist Leninist thought, or say Lenin more specifically in practice, was there an idea that, okay, you seize power with violence, but once you're in power, then you have a different form of government, which doesn't require violence. Then you become closer to some element of democratic, power, sort of devolution of power or something, or decentralization, or some other idea of, like, when you're in power, something changes. That what gets you into power isn't what keeps you in power.
Well, I think probably the idea is that eventually things would settle down. But in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of violence. Again, if you read through the military program of the Proletarian Revolution, which Lenin wrote right before seizing power in Russia, he was quite clear not just that there would be an extremely violent civil war in Russia, again, something to be welcomed, but that because Russia might be the first communist country. The first were the proletarians. Again, the alleged proletarians would be seizing power. You'd have the dictatorship of the proletariat. They would then be surrounded by a sea of enemies. That is, a bunch of non-communist countries who would inevitably be at war with that country. And so you'd have to fight and win your first civil war, but then you'd have a series of wars to come between the communist countries and the capitalist countries. And those wars in turn would require mass mobilization and mass violence. So that I think eventually, yes, the idea that I suppose he's updating Marx on the fly and being a little more realistic about expectations. But the idea is that, yes, eventually in some world where the communists have triumphed everywhere, then eventually, yes, things will settle down and you won't have the need for constant churn and radical political violence. That said, I don't think the state withers away. I mean, this is something that one of the reasons I talk about is Russian anarchist Bakunin, who cross swords with Marx in the First International in the early chapters of the book, is that I think he sussed out right away. He intuited, both from the Manifesto of the Communist Party and also Das Kapital, and also just the way Marx behaved when he created the first Working Man's International Association and insisted on enforcing doctrinal purity on everyone, was that he sensed that in the end, the very idea of the abolition of private property and state control of the banks, state control of the means of production, and state control of foreign trade, and the centralization of credit, and the confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels is all right there in the manifesto, by the way. That all of this would require an extremely powerful, centralized and tyrannical central government authority, as he called it, statism. You know, you would have to have a powerful state. And you're right that some Marxists have believed that eventually the state would wither away, and there's still some people today who are going to say that's what Marx really meant. It's hard to say because Marx never really spelled out exactly what the final utopia would look like. But those who have kind of read Marx's ideas and come to their conclusions about them, again, whether they're supporters or people like Lenin, who's kind of using Marx's ideas, or critics like Bakunin, what most of them seem to agree was that you did need a powerful state. I mean, like Lenin did. I mean, to say in practice, so while they did try in the first couple of years in power to centralize everything and even to abolish money, I mean, they tried to make it so that, you know, everything from like riding a tram to going to a cafeteria to just conducting your daily business, that you wouldn't need money. Effectively, everything would be rationed and controlled by ration cards and some type of ticketing system. They tried this for a while. It didn't work. It turned out to be basically impossible, and the whole economy collapsed. And some of that was because of what they did with the banks. They basically seized the banks, and all the records, you know, were pretty much like lost or destroyed. And so you couldn't get any money to industry, and so they had to lay off all the workers. Eventually, you got just an industrial and manufacturing collapse across the country by 1920, 1921. So they did retrench. Like the only really interesting debate about and of different paths in Soviet history is that Lenin died before really making a final decision on this. Was called the New Economic Policy, which is basically, I mean, you could sum it up almost in 3 words. You know, we give up, at least we give up for now, maybe call it 5 words. We give up for now. We're not going to create communism yet because we don't know how to run businesses, how to run an economy. So they had to invite back private entrepreneurs, let the peasants trade and sell their grain, let people start to manufacture things again, let them sell them. The service sector, the private sector was allowed. What Lenin insisted on maintaining state control of then was, he called it the commanding heights of the economy. So he meant by that heavy industry, anything related to military production, anything related to foreign trade, and the banks. Other than that, everything had been privatized. And Lenin was never quite clear. At times he made it sound like he would even say, you know, we're going to need years, maybe even this might be reckoned in decades. That is, we'd have to let this play out. The foremost theoretician of the New Economic Policy, Bukharin, you know, who Stalin initially supported and then, of course, violently dispensed with later on. Bukharin seemed to think that there was maybe some alternative path to the final communist destination if you would allow private grain trading and private manufacturing and retail to proceed for long enough so that eventually you'd get a kind of capital formation you could use to finance and fuel industrialization. But also, this is the part that's a little fuzzier. He seemed to think eventually that the state managers would learn from the private managers how to outcompete them, that it was kind of a competition. And he admitted that for now the government was losing, but he thought eventually the government would learn to compete. And this is one of the reasons why, you know, let's say his books, and even interestingly enough, a biography of him by a Princeton historian called Stephen Cohen on the Bukharin alternative, as it's sometimes called, was translated and published and became almost mandatory reading for a lot of party apparatchiks in communist China in the early 1980s under the Deng Xiaoping reforms. The idea is, look, maybe we should allow a certain level of private sector economic activity because, they might be more effective producers than we are. But the state was still supposed to retain the ultimate control. And Bukharin was a little vague about that, like Lenin was, like how long would it take? And would the state eventually just, seize back control of the means of production? Would the state tolerate this, but tax heavily? Would the state play favorites and allow certain businesses to thrive? And it's kind of like what we see in China today. If you fall afoul of the state for whatever reason, they just seize it back. What was interesting about all this is not just that some people like Cohen thought this was a legitimate alternative to communism, but that Stalin's decision to go the other way was so dramatic, that he didn't just decide, look, we're going to collectivize agriculture and have these 5-year plans to plan industrial activity supposedly down to the last detail. But that all those private traders that we were temporarily tolerating, we're not going to tolerate them, we're going to arrest them all and send them to labor camps. So, 2.7 million or something of the NEP men, as they were called, were arrested and sent to labor camps. And so you see why Cohen and certain others have said, oh, well, maybe there was a Bukharin alternative. Politically, I don't think there was. Economically, sure. I mean, they could have just allowed private traders to thrive. But, the longer you have that, the less you have communism. Whereas Stalin said, no, we want to have communism. And so he said, we can't tolerate this forever. We have to make an effort to do it. And part of the reason he did was partly necessity, I think partly political vision, was that basically the state was losing. The state was losing the battle. The collectives where the state was producing the supposed offerings of state production, there was just nothing there to buy. And so the peasants were no longer really even bringing their grain to market. And so the cities started starving again. And so Stalin basically said, look, we can't let the peasants control agriculture. And this turns out to be really the sine qua non of almost all of the communist regimes, is that you haven't really tried it seriously unless you bludgeon the peasants. You have to actually go in and seize control of agriculture. And seize control, particularly grain, because you can kind of store it centrally in these grain silos, surrounded by men with machine guns, and then distribute it. And until you're doing that, and there's something they had all agreed on. You saw it in Etienne Morley, you saw it in Gracchus Babeuf, you saw it in Marx. The state had to seize control of agriculture. It's right there in the Communist Manifesto. If you don't do that, you can't really control the country.
With that backdrop, why weren't there? What were there uprisings against the state? Against Lenin to try to topple him?
Absolutely, and not just under Lenin. I mean, the literature on this used to be a little thinner, in part because we didn't have access to the resources. And I do have to credit Orlando Figes, the British historian, the first one to do really serious work among Western historians on what he called the Peasant Wars. So this is the very early years after the Revolution, where the government actually they literally had these things called kind of food commissioner brigades and food armies. They would go out and just seize grain and food from the peasants. And, by early 1921, half the country was an armed uprising against the government. I mean, it's almost like this natural progression. While the so-called whites and some of the foreign armies were still on Russian soil, some of the peasants were willing to tolerate the government, or they were drafted, of course, into the Red Army. But once almost all of those foreign armies, including even Poland, because Poland had fought a brief war in 1920, once all the foreign armies were gone, that's when really kind of, to some extent, the real class or social war begins between the new Bolshevik government and basically the peasant masses. And, in that war, we have, in some cases, very sketchy information. Every so often you'll come across a really striking statistic, like that the Red Army incurred something like 238,000 casualties fighting peasants, most of whom didn't even have firearms. They're fighting with kind of farm tools, implements, pitchforks, and whatnot. So these were pitched battles. It was very, very serious. And what started to happen then in the Stalin period as well, I mean, basically, again, Lenin had given up. He had allowed the peasants to go back their way because the government had effectively lost. Although, they rolled up the most serious kind of partisan armies and, dispatched with the leaders and so on. As far as controlling the peasants and the food supply, they actually failed, and that's why they had a new economic policy. Stalin then went back on the offensive, and this time they were a little better armed, a little better prepared, and a little bit more ruthless. And so this is a period that in Ukraine, for example, is remembered as the Holodomor, this terror, hunger, famine of the early 1930s, where they really did seize control of the grain supply and herd the peasants onto these collective and state farms, and of course, mass deport people off to the gulag camps. And when you started to see the resistance, that's when things got really violent. So you could see this in 1930, for example, where they start talking about, you can even see it in the files, the number of uprisings in each district and how they have to be crushed kind of with force and with mercy. And this is part of what then justifies the further repression of the so-called kulaks, supposedly rich peasants, but you might be rich if you owned a cow, for example, or if you had someone working for you, that might classify you as a rich peasant who had to be dealt with as a class enemy. And they did this in other parts, even more backwards parts of the Soviet Union. Not backwards is maybe not the right, but more traditional places like Kazakhstan, where there's still a lot of nomads, and where they collectivized agriculture in almost a pre-modern kind of culture and society. And again, there's a lot of new work on this once the archives were opened up. And again, you have to be a little bit cautious with the estimates, but you're talking about 1.5 to 2 million people either starved to death or were somehow killed in these things. These were real conflicts fought against, in some cases, nomads, in other cases, again, peasants, small producers. So the government did eventually take the fight to them, and there was absolutely armed resistance. And this is what then justified the further repression. So that effectively you had this kind of state of almost like a colonial occupation of parts of Ukraine. A story which is still, although it's very well known, of course, in Ukraine, it's very little known in the West, in part because there haven't been a lot of popular accounts of it. There was a movie that came out a few years ago, Mr. Jones, which was in some ways the first real Hollywood-ish attempt, although it was not financed by any of the Hollywood studios. It was actually jointly financed by Poland and Ukraine. Perhaps not surprisingly, two countries that did want to focus on certain Soviet crimes, and timing wasn't great. It came out kind of the height of, I think, the first COVID year when most movie theaters were shut down. And so I don't know if it would have been popular anyway, because it's not exactly a crowd pleaser. There are scenes of cannibalism. It's a very dark movie. But this is one of the reasons why I talk about the movie, not just that it's a really serious attempt to grapple with this dark episode in 20th century history, but this somewhat notorious New York Times journalist, Walter Duranty, who was famous for reporting what I guess we now call fake news, basically that that there was no starvation. The peasants were hungry but not starving. There was no starvation in Ukraine, although apparently he told someone else off the record that, I think probably maybe 10 million people had starved to death. But that's not what he wrote in the New York Times. And perversely, he was given the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting. Anyway, there's a great performance of the Walter Duranty character in the movie. I highly recommend it to everyone. I think the actor's name is Sarsgaard, I believe. Wonderfully sinister performance. It's just, he finally got the treatment I think he deserved.
I have to look out for that film. Now, we've covered a lot of ground. I mean, I do want to go into China, but we obviously have to talk about Stalin as well. And you've written a fantastic book on that, Stalin's Wars, which I'd recommend. But from my understanding, one of the key aspects of Stalin was his pact with the Nazis, and then the expansion of kind of the communist empire, you could say, that pact, and then what happened after the war allowed Stalin to do. So in your eyes, what was the big change that Stalin brought about in the whole sort of communist movement or communist story compared to, say, Lenin?
Well, I think he was just more successful. I mean, it's interesting if you look at the way Russians look back on Lenin and Stalin today, and I'm obviously generalizing. Russians have various views and so on, but kind of the more popular view of a lot of Russians, particularly kind of Russians who are more patriotic or nationalistic today, they really have no time for Lenin, because Lenin might have overthrown the Tsarist regime. But then, of course, the early Lenin years were years of civil war, when Russia actually lost a lot of territory, and they lost places that used to belong to Tsarist Russia, like Finland, like the 3 Baltic states. They did eventually reconquer anyway, parts of Ukraine, which had been part of Tsarist Russia, but they then actually lost territory in the war with Poland too. So even though eventually the Bolsheviks win, the borders were actually kind of truncated. So from a Russian, you might say, a nationalist perspective, Lenin is not very successful, whereas Stalin expanded the map. He expanded the borders. And he did so in a lot of different ways. I mean, some of it was this cynical diplomacy with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, getting a free hand in the Baltic states and Finland, even in Romania, to expand the borders of then Soviet Ukraine into basically Poland and Romania. But because this pact, it didn't backfire right away, but eventually, because Hitler turned on Stalin, as we know, invaded the Soviet Union. For a little while, it looked like those boundaries were kind of shrinking. But through a lot of different things, kind of, you might say some of it was just apt diplomacy, some of it was Western naivete. I talk about in Stalin's war with all of the Lend-Lease aid and all the rest of it. But you have to give Stalin credit. I mean, whether it was, again, sticking it out in Moscow and staying there and not evacuating in 1941 when the Nazis came closest, or whether it was just very adept and adroit, somewhat blunt, but adroit diplomacy with Roosevelt and Churchill at the various big three summits. And then eventually, I suppose, figuring out ways of not oppressing his generals too heavily, which they had done in the early days. A lot of them were kind of put to death, where they weren't allowed to retreat. Eventually, he allowed more of his generals to have enough leeway out in the field that eventually there was kind of a meritocracy between them. I mean, the losses, of course, were horrendous. This is the part. I mean, we're always supposed to view the sacrifices of the Red Army as almost just too sacred to question in the war. You're talking about losses of as much as 25 or 30 million people. So this isn't exactly a ringing success for the efficiency of the Soviet regime. But they did win in the end, and we should not forget this. I mean, this is the main fact, is they won, and they did eventually expand the boundaries of communism. So in the first sense, it's just that he is a successful conqueror. And again, you could say, some people used to say, oh, this is because he wasn't fully communist, or he had become more of a kind of Russian nationalist monkey. No, he was absolutely a believing communist. I think he was just like Lenin, but in some ways more successful. He was seizing opportunities. Remember, Lenin had said the Soviets would eventually be at war with the capitalist world, and we didn't know which countries would be at war with one another, but basically we had to arm ourselves and we had to exploit these wars in order to expound the boundaries of communism. He had laid it all out in the military program of the Proletarian Revolution. So there's nothing really new in a doctrinal sense about what Stalin's doing. It's just that he was more successful in doing so. And then eventually he had satellites, of course. He had these other communist countries, which were now part of the communist bloc or the communist world. Now, it's true that they didn't all prove to be perfectly loyal, so that you had Tito in Yugoslavia expressing a little bit of kind of rumblings of discontent, and eventually, of course, Mao in China, to some extent, goes his own way, and you get the Sino-Soviet split by the 1960s. But what's interesting about all of this is, even when you're seeing, let's say, Tito supposedly going his own way a little bit in Yugoslavia, or Mao going his own way in China, they're not going their own way because they are less communist. In fact, if anything, they might be even more ruthlessly communist in certain aspects. Like, Tito was one of the first to nationalize all of industry and to kind of obliterate independent peasant agriculture in Yugoslavia. Again, at least on paper. In practice, they never quite achieved their so-called targets. And, quite an innovator in terms of political repression. One of the things he broke with Stalin over was that Stalin had made a tactical deal with Churchill that he would allow Greece to remain in the Western sphere of influence. But Tito said, no, that's not right. It's kind of perverse that Churchill was so fond of Tito, because what Tito wanted to do was to bring communism to Greece. That was actually one of the things he broke with Stalin over. Stalin was actually more pragmatic than Tito. And in the case of Mao, I mean, what's so fascinating about the Sino-Soviet split is, again, it's not that Mao is kind of objecting to Stalinism or Soviet totalitarianism. Rather, he thinks that Khrushchev was too soft and that he had kind of rebuked Stalin. I mean, there's a secret speech. He had criticized Stalin for repression and for political violence and purging the party. And then when Mao launches the Great Leap Forward in 1958, Khrushchev rebukes him, saying, you're trying to do the same thing we tried to do in the early 30s. In some ways, the Chinese went even further with, their idea of these kind of backyard blast furnaces and all the rest of it. But he said, there's no reason for you to repeat our stupid mistakes, he said. But Mao wanted to repeat them and actually do them on an even grander scale. So again, you did get a little bit of a disloyalty. It's not that all communist countries always took orders from Moscow, but certainly the Eastern European ones did. They had the new version of the Communist International, what was called the Common Form. They had Comecon for centralized economic planning. But yeah, mostly Stalin was just, again, more successful than Lenin, you might say, in spreading the boundaries of communism.
And from everything you described, it doesn't sound like it's a particularly appealing place to live, these countries. Yet, communism, you could say, reached its peak around the 1970s. So, this is like a long time where you've had Lenin, Stalin, and then the post-Stalin leaders. So, I mean, why did communism spread so far and wide up until the 70s? Like,
I think there are a lot
of countries adopt this? Ethiopia, you talk about
right.
Cuba, Cambodia, Vietnam, all these other countries.
Well, again, the opportunities are kind of evolving and changing over time. So that in the Second World War, you had obviously just the spread of this devastating war to Europe and eventually to Asia. And this creates opportunities both for communism just to take root, but also for the spread of communism literally in the form of these red armies and sharing weapons and so on with Mao or imposing it on Eastern Europe really by force of arms. The Cold War and particularly decolonization, which in a lot of ways was related to the Cold War. I mean, I don't have a lot of time in the book to talk about, kind of aspects of U.S. policy in places like Africa. But one of the really interesting aspects of the Cold War is that with certain exceptions, like the way the U.S. decided it wanted to prop up the French Empire initially in Indochina, part of the backstory of the Vietnam War, for the most part, the U.S. was an anti-colonial power. And this is certainly true. You can see it under Roosevelt in the Second World War, the way he's actually dealing with Churchill. And always he's even more hostile to Churchill and the British Empire than he is to Stalin. And then into the Cold War, curiously enough, in episodes such as the Suez Crisis, the U.S. and the Soviets line up on the same side. They're basically against kind of the European colonial powers. And part of it is just because I think of the propaganda struggle of the Cold War. Neither side wanted to seem like they're backing imperialism because imperialism was now increasingly in foul stead politically. And so the struggle to almost capture the image and be on the side of the angels in the decolonization and the emergence of what is called a term first coined by French intellectuals, the Third World, the U.S. ends up almost kind of helping to ease along decolonization, particularly by pulling the rug out from under Britain and France in the Suez Crisis. And decolonization turns out to be a godsend for communism. First of all, because with European powers often either departing from these countries, maybe they didn't depart from all of them fully. I mean, they still had various kind of officials and advisors, but at least as far as like the full-on occupation, they're departing. The new governments are looking for trading partners or investors. And in some cases, the U.S. steps in. And of course, the U.S. did pretty well in a lot of areas in the Cold War. But for the Soviets, it's a great opportunity. They can come in and pose as a non-imperialist, basically. I mean, it was a huge strategy in the Khrushchev years in particular, and then it actually kind of reached its full fruition in the Brezhnev years. That is for the Soviets to offer this new model. You can kind of have development, and we will help you build hydroelectric dams, and we will help you modernize your infrastructure and your military and so on. But you won't have to kowtow to the European powers. And particularly communism, I mean, if you just think about this practically, if you're an aspiring kleptocrat, the vision of communism is a lot more helpful because after all, they want the state to control the economy. And so if the state controls the economy, then the new kleptocrat kind of controls everything. And so I think just practically it sort of works, it fits really well. I mean, there was one Cuban communist dissident, who had this great line about how at a certain point in the Cold War, communism almost turned into a sort of an American fast food franchise, just in the sense that there was a very easily replicable formula, kind of like, okay, well, here you go. Here are your KGB advisors. Here are your arms. We'll help arm your security services. We'll help train your soldiers. And, we'll help teach you how to surveil the population. Here's how you do the censorship. Here's how you nationalize the property. Here's how you make sure that you kind of control all of the cash flows. There was a kind of a formula which was easily exportable. I mean, maybe in the end, it tended to impoverish, or at the very least, really not to help these countries thrive. So maybe in the long run, the economic model probably had less to recommend it. And I think that's part of the reason why, obviously, you see fewer communist countries today, just in the strict sense of adherence to the Communist Party. There was this big kind of counter move in the 1980s, the Reagan-Thatcher years, the emergence of, this new idea that actually, even in Britain, right, the government had taken a much bigger state role in the economy by the 70s, and they began to privatize. And there was this idea that certain level of privatization would help efficiency, and varieties of this even took root in China. I think what we were left with, though, was that even a lot of communist governments gave up on the ambition of the full control of the means of production of every single economic activity. But what lasted, the residue, you might say, was the practices, the techniques that they had learned in things like social control, a social credit system. Again, they didn't call this in the communist years, but that's kind of what it was, right? You had to either join the party, you join the pioneers, the Komsomol. This is the way you advanced in society, was by maintaining good political standing with the regime, voting in all the compulsory fake elections, going to all the meetings, never making trouble. These are the ways in which people advanced in those systems. And, increasingly, I think we have some version of that in the West. It's obviously not as rigid. You don't have a single party rule necessarily, but we have varieties of this, I think, now in the West, in the same way China is really, I think, kind of perfected. Not that they perfected the economy. I don't think they built a better mousetrap or anything like that. I think a lot of the reports of the Chinese economic miracle are I think we should be at the very least skeptical about some of the claims of the efficiency of planning. Rather, I think the political model has proved to be quite durable and really difficult to eradicate.
And on the political control, if we do a sort of a compare or contrast to the Soviets with the Chinese, the Soviets suddenly just collapsed. You could say, at least as an outsider, it looks like in late 80s, early 90s, suddenly the whole system collapsed, which kind of seems a bit paradoxical given the amount of control they had. You would have thought they would have been able to squash any protests. So that's
Sure.
one question. Then the other one is, why did China endure? Why didn't they also collapse the communist regime within China?
Well, one of the themes or one of the comparisons I try to make in the book, obviously both countries are not identical. They're not the same. They also had a slightly different security profile. So the Soviets, for example, were increasingly burdened by the expenditures of superpower competition. It is one of the reasons why Reagan's arm buildup and SDI, and then particularly the kind of the oil weapon, we might call it, when particularly the U.S. helps lean on Saudi Arabia to help drive down the oil price with spare production capacity and just kind of goosing the markets in the mid-1980s. They knew that the Soviets were increasingly dependent on energy revenue to prop up really their empire. Remember, they had this massive global empire. Even a country such as Cuba under Castro was receiving something like $5 billion a year in subsidies. As part of the reason that the Cuban economy collapsed after the fall of the Soviet Union is they lost these subsidies. They're actually ahead of the Americans in a lot of sectors in the arms race. They're supporting this vast infrastructure in Europe, and in the end, it's a little bit subtle with Gorbachev. I actually think Gorbachev, had he been more effective, more supple, and also more ruthless, could have actually kept, if not the entirety of the empire, there might have had to be a little bit of triage, but he definitely could have kept, I think, the Communist Party in power in the Soviet Union. There's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding about what perestroika was. This is Gorbachev's so-called restructuring plan, because to some extent it was similar to what was going on in China. There were a lot of things like, new collectives and free enterprise zones, the effort to inject a little bit more private sector energy into the economy. In the Soviet Union, there was also quality control, which turned out to be not as effective, in part because they just realized so many consumer products were inferior in all of this. But the actual point of perestroika, if you actually look at the Soviet planning documents, was a massive arms buildup. They're absolutely responding to Reagan's arms buildup. They have production targets, this new 5-year plan. They're basically trying to outcompete the Americans. So in the first sense, it's that the Soviets had to do that. The Chinese weren't really trying to do that. They'd fought a proxy war like the Soviets had with the Americans in Indochina, and they had certain foreign policy prerogatives in Southeast Asia. But China did not really have the global superpower profile that the Soviets did. So they didn't have the same guns and butter problem. In addition to that, there are a lot of similarities. Again, the Chinese economy was suffering from kind of incipient, not quite hyperinflation, but pretty serious inflation about 1989, the same way the Soviets were. Again, the difference was that the Soviets were facing this while they were also maintaining occupying troops all through Europe. And obviously they have this huge empire, even in the Soviet Union proper. And in the end, it was just, I guess there were just too many fires that they had difficulty putting out. But a factor, again, which I don't think is generally appreciated, is that, Gorbachev, first of all, despite his image of being this pacifist in the West, he was absolutely prosecuting the war in Afghanistan right up through 1988. There were a number of violent crackdowns on protesters in Central Asia, in places like Almaty in Kazakhstan, in the Transcaucasus, in places like Tbilisi, Georgia. Later on in the Baltics, which got a lot more Western press attention in places like Lithuania. And it's not that he was unwilling to use force to put down protesters, but every time he did so, he became a little bit more squeamish. And I think it was partly because he'd almost fallen in love with his image in the West. He had been so lovingly greeted by these Western crowds. And I think he kind of fell in love with this idea of himself as this global leader who was, associated at the very least with peaceful relations. A lot of it was coming from Reagan too, up until 1988 and early 89. But Gorbachev really thought that he had this important image in the West. And so I think in the end, he backed down and he started rebuking his own military commanders when they were following his own orders and cracking down on protest. The other thing is, he was a terrible negotiator. I mean, a lot of people look back on what is this now notorious exchange regarding NATO expansion with James Baker in early 1990. And that's interesting enough, just that Gorbachev got nothing in writing, that he just vaguely thought, but I hope you don't expand NATO, but he never got anything down in writing. In addition to that, he basically negotiated the end of the Soviet Empire in Europe and got almost nothing in return. So that for basically giving up East Germany and Berlin, kind of these central pieces on the European chessboard, he got, a few billions of Deutschmarks that the Germans agreed to help pay for resettlement costs of Soviet troops leaving Germany, and a little bit to help buy new apartments for them or build a few new apartment buildings back in Moscow. He was begging Bush for dollars in 1990, basically to surrender the Cold War. And what's kind of amazing about it is he was even saying, my generals are already saying, I'm selling out my empire in Eastern Europe for Deutschmarks. Meanwhile, I'd like to sell it out for dollars now. Bush, I mean, we could say maybe he missed an opportunity, but he was unwilling to do this. Basically, Gorbachev was offering to surrender across the board. And, this is part of the reasons why later on most Russians despised Gorbachev. He ran for president in 1996 and got some votes, but he got less than 1%, which is a little bit humiliating for the former general secretary who was running the empire for 6 years. He got less than 1% of the vote. Most Russians saw him as, if not a traitor, then someone who had surrendered the empire for marks, for Deutschmarks, and for dollars, which in a sense he had done. I don't think he had to do that. I think he really misplayed things. There's a great book on this, by the way, in addition to mine, a book that I draw on that I should highly recommend by Bill Odom, called, I believe, The Collapse of the Soviet Military. And, his basic argument is that the Soviets did not have to lose the Cold War, that a lot of this was just Gorbachev's horrendous leadership in the way that he, I call him a little bit, he's a little bit like the Kerensky of the collapse of the Soviet Union, something that happened with Kerensky in the Kornilov affair in 1917. He lost support of the officer corps. So like what happens in the August 91 coup, and Gorbachev's role is still debated. Was he under house arrest? Was he in communication with the plotters? Both things are kind of true. Whether they were going to fight for him or fight for the regime or fight for communism, basically in the end, the officers just weren't willing to fight for it. And then in the end, the men, effectively, it was kind of a mutiny, and they went over to Yeltsin.
So I see. I mean, I can see it's a fantastic point about the Soviet Empire overstretch and so on, and Gorbachev, a negotiator. But how has the communist regime in China survived so long? It's decades and decades after that. How they maintained control for so long.
Well, I think in the first place, they learned from Soviet mistakes. I mean, even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, you obviously had Tiananmen Square showing a ruthlessness that Gorbachev lacked. I mean, it's horrible what happened there, but they obviously showed they were not going to tolerate dissent beyond a certain level. They moved in and they absolutely crushed those protests with malice aforethought, with horrendous bloodshed and casualties. But in addition to that, I think it's often said, was there a China? Some people have posed the question a different way. Was there a China model for the Soviets that they could have, used to kind of seize power? And one way of looking at that is that, the big mistake was not necessarily perestroika. The big mistake in Soviet Union was glasnost, where they did allow certain press freedoms and discussion of corruption and mistakes and all the rest of it. And I don't think that was fatal in the end, but it obviously didn't help. Whereas the Chinese decided, we will allow certain elements of economic experimentation and at least greater private sector freedom, a greater role for the private sector, but we will not make any political concessions. I mean, even before the 91 coup, Gorbachev had started liberalizing the political system too. Again, the elections weren't completely real. The elections of the Congress of People's Deputies in 1989. In most of the districts, there was still only one communist candidate on the ballot. But they allowed some non-communists to run, or they allowed some kind of rogue renegade communists like Yeltsin to run. And they did allow this body to convene, and they did allow them to have discussion and to criticize Gorbachev for the first time kind of on national television and all the rest of it. Again, this wasn't liberalism and democracy exactly, but it was enough of a softening of the kind of social controls and the government repression and government censorship that in the end, it really did weaken their position. So then the 91 coup, maybe it was a close run thing, but they had salted just enough of the public with the idea that maybe the communists could be criticized and maybe you could move beyond communism. Whereas in China, they maintained political control, I think control of the media, control of censorship, control of communications. Obviously, there's still the ruthlessness you'll see with protesters in Hong Kong, with Falun Gong, with obviously Tiananmen Square itself. If there ever is a hint of a protest, it seems to be contained fairly effectively. I think they have learned through practice, and they've learned through Soviet mistakes what not to do. That is to say, just not to allow political freedoms and freedom of discussion, with various kind of firewall controls of the internet and the use of even some imported Western technologies and search engines to surveil and control people's movements, obviously communications. I mean, in some ways, I would have to think, if very few of those old Soviet leaders are alive today, but if they were, they would marvel at just how easy it now is for not just China's government, but all Western governments to keep track of the people and their movements. We now have these little devices in our pockets, and they know where we are at all times. And oftentimes, devices actually listen to us, right?
Yeah, on that, one of the provocative things you have in your writings and in this book is this notion that Western countries are adopting some of these ideas from communism, that it's not just communism over there, it's coming over here.
Right.
That's quite a provocative, statement to make. We have elections. There's elections here, freedom,
Sure.
apparent freedom of speech. There's private property and so on. So how can you make that, bold statement?
Well, it's obviously a matter of degree. I'm not trying to say that, right, we're all being sent off to gulag camps and that we have anything on the scale of the great proletarian cultural revolution or the Great Leap Forward in China as far as repression. Rather, we have these elements that are starting to appear where people increasingly don't really feel free to speak their minds, whether it's in the workplace or in college campuses or in many cases online in certain fora. Because these things are both recorded and they're tracked and they can be used against us. And again, it might just be you don't get that job because of something you said on social media when you were 17 years old, or you don't get into the college that you wanted because, you have done something provocative or a little bit offensive or controversial online. It can work the other way, to be fair. Obviously, sometimes you might get canceled by one side and then kind of adopted by the other side. And then that increasingly does seem to happen where you have this almost political tribalism in a country like the United States. But increasingly, social media is an area where I think a lot of people do realize they have to be very careful what they say. In the UK today, there are a lot of people who have actually been arrested, in many cases imprisoned over social media posts. It doesn't seem to have happened to quite the same degree in most other Western countries, but there are elements of this. Freedom of speech in the way we talk about the United States with the First Amendment, we do have we still do have First Amendment protections. Maybe sometimes they can be kind of violated in spirits, but at least we have the laws. A lot of countries in Europe, they really don't even have those laws. There are a lot of things that are literally illegal to say in places like Germany, for example. And I think increasingly in the UK. So again, it's a matter of degree. I'm not trying to say that we're all living through some simulacrum of the great proletarian cultural revolution in China. There don't seem to be Red Guards going around, with machine guns, beating up recalcitrant bourgeois intellectual types. Rather, I think it's this feeling that our freedoms are being eroded and that privacy is, again, some of it just because of the growth of technology. It's not all because it's nefarious, but we also have this increasing. I think there's kind of this network, almost this panopticon effect, where the social media companies and IT and the search engines, we all now know, of course, that they have collaborated with the governments. A lot of this emerged, even before the kind of the COVID era, with things like the scandals about the NSA and spying and surveillance and all the rest of it in the United States, going back to the revelations from Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks and others, about what the government was up to in collusion with social media companies. Again, in some ways, it's more effective because I think it is less overt. They're not sending around KGB, Stasi-style heavies, to forcibly interrogate people or, bug your apartment or follow you around and you have a shadow everywhere you go. These things that people almost mock now about the Soviet Union. You'd have this KGB man following you around. Maybe you'd buy him an ice cream. It's a lot more subtle now. But, in some ways, again, it just depends on the integrity and hopefully the good faith and good sense of our rulers, because they have the tools. They have the tools to surveil, control, censor, and oppress us. We just have to hope that they don't really use them because the tools are there now, and they're probably more powerful, I think, than ever before. That's to say, it really would not be hard if whatever one of the alleged 17 intelligence agencies that we have in the federal government, if they get onto someone, as a threat or as someone that needs monitoring, that you want to make sure that that person is under control. It's very easy for them to do. So we have to just hope that that most of us kind of either avoid their eye or that they're feeling merciful towards us. But the fact is, the tools are there. Again, the tools are not all used, fortunately, but the tools are absolutely there. And I think had the Soviet leaders had those tools in the 70s and 80s, I think the Soviet Union would absolutely still exist today.
Wow. Well, it's a fantastic discussion. We could carry on for much longer, but I did want to round off with a couple of personal questions. One is around, what advice would you give to people leaving university for the real world? We have some younger people listening to the podcast, and it's always good for them to hear, from people like yourself about what advice you'd give them.
Well, that's really a tough one, because a lot of it is going to depend on their talent, skills, interest, their profile, what it is that they want to do for a living. If people are thinking about becoming an academic historian, I would generally say it's probably not a great time to be an academic historian. The job market is not great, and obviously we have kind of demographic questions about identity politics and how you fit into that game. Maybe some people have slightly better opportunities than others. There are a lot of people who go abroad now because there aren't that many jobs in the West. I'd like to say follow your dreams and speak your mind. But again, I think I have to even be cautious there. I think speak your mind to the extent that you are able to, that you are in a forum where you can actually trust the people that you're speaking with. Unfortunately, I think we now do increasingly live in this world where, there might be paths forward, where you are going to be a little bit freer to speak your mind, and you'll be around people who, kind of respect you and respect your views and respect what you're doing. Work hard. I think that's the main thing. Work hard, follow your dreams, and seize opportunities when they come to you. I think it's hard to predict what those opportunities are going to be. I've been, I think, fortunate in some ways, maybe unlucky in others in my life. I think the opportunities today for people, on the one hand, there are all kinds of ways you can develop a presence, a profile online, on social media. I think there are risks and perils to doing that, though. I honestly don't really understand how most people make a living now out of media. So I think I'm the last person that you probably come to for advice about that. People seem to do it. I have no idea how they do. So I'm not going to pretend like I understand.
Okay, and then you've been obviously a prolific writer. You published many books, including this latest one, To Overthrow the World. But what are some of the books that influence you?
Oh, that's a great question. As far as other historians who worked on this subject, communism, I was certainly influenced by Richard Pipes. He was a very important figure back in the 90s, even if I criticized him a little bit for this kind of low-hanging fruit about the line of writing the obituary of communism. His works on Russian history and on the revolution, I think in many ways were seminal. Martin Malia was an advisor of mine at Berkeley, more of an intellectual historian. I think Pipes is really more of a kind of a classic political historian. He was someone whose ideas, he had all these lines that kind of still stick in the mind. One was, I think he said, "There's no such thing as socialism, and the Soviet Union built it." And I still haven't quite figured out what he meant by that, but it's this
Great line.
This line that has kind of been it's endlessly fascinating, endlessly intriguing. But all kinds of works, I suppose, on military history. Just a shout out to my friend Nick Lloyd, I think, because he set such a great example, I think, with his own work. My different works, I think, have been inspired by kind of different historians. I mentioned Neil Ferguson, the one Niall Neil Ferguson.
Former guest.
He's someone
we've had him on my. I've had him on my show as well.
Right. Pity of War for me, particularly on the First World War, was a seminal work. It got all of us thinking about the war and just kind of different ways of looking at and thinking about the war. So, with my work on the First World War, I think that work was absolutely critical. So anyway, those are a few names that come to mind, just people who've kind of influenced me over the years. Advisors that taught me, people like Jim Sheehan. His wife, actually, Peggy Anderson, was an advisor of mine. David Kennedy, historian at Stanford, I think just really a great lecturer, a prolific historian. Something of a model. Again, I haven't drawn on his work as much directly because my interests are slightly different from him. But again, my teachers in high school, I have to really give a shout out to them because I have to say Brian Bell and Debbie Doyle were an inspiration, and I don't think I'd be where I am today without them.
Great. No, that's great. Now, I'm going to include a link to your book in the show notes. And aside from that, what's the best way for people to reach out or to follow your work in general?
Well, I don't really have much of a social media
Okay.
profile as such. I do have an agent, Andrew Lowney, and he has information about my books and translation deals on his website. So I think it's andrewlowney.net. You can Google Lowney,
Okay. Yeah.
Lownie, and then my name, and you can find that. Obviously, Amazon, you can find the books publisher's website. Basic Books has published most of my books. And so, they have on their own website, if you want to go directly to the source, directly to the publisher. But for people to get in touch with me, I do have a work email via my employer, Bard College. So that's obviously the way that a lot of people get in touch with me. I may not respond right away because my official work email does tend to get flooded with incoming, but I will do my best.
Okay, that's great. And so, with that, it's a fantastic conversation and keep up the good work.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It was a great pleasure, below.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.